Hi everyone, this is Oscar from Underdog, and today I want to do a small exercise in organic techno. At Underdog we do a lot of dance music. Often that can mean that we are doing something that has a kick drum every 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, right? And that is fine and that is great. But I think there are some artists out there who really do a wonderful job at breaking that standard assumption and that succeed at creating these beautiful, pulsating, impressive, powerful pieces of music using all the genre ideas of techno, but without limiting themselves to that 4 to the floor beat pattern. One particular one that I want to look at today is Paula Temple, and we're going to make something like this beat from Death Vox. Okay, you see that? Holy shit. That is super organic and powerful in a way that I find very inspiring. So I spent some time experimenting with how to get to a sound like this, and I want to share with you in, let's say, 5 levels, how to get to something pretty close. The final product that we're working towards is something like this. So that's kind of going into that organic techno vibe. Let's explore what the different concepts are that make up such a beat. Before we go any further, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and click the little bell icon because we need the channel to grow up. We're on the way to 1,000 subscribers. Let's do this. Now back to the track. If we remember Paula Temple's track, there is a lot going on. But in a situation like this, it's important to zoom in and zoom out to understand the simplest possible way that this beat could be described, and then go into all the little complexities and nuances that are inside there. And fundamentally, at its core, what it does is boom, boom, click, boom, boom, click, boom, boom, click, boom, boom. Check this out. One, two, click, 1, 2, click, 1, 2, click, 1, 2, click, and everything else is sort of secondary texture around that. So if you're dancing, that's the tempo, that's the pattern that you're dancing to. So let's start with that as the base layer of what we're trying to do. So step number 1 is the essential pattern. To create the essential pattern, all I did was make a drum rack, choose myself some samples. So this sample for the kick, and then a combination of this and this for the little snare rimshot kind of sound. So it would go, I layer these two together simply because this one has a good crunchy body to it, and this one has that little bit of freshness that we're going to need to offset against the distortion of everything else. And so very simply, in MIDI, I programmed the following pattern. 1, 2, clack, 1, 2, clack. Let's listen to that. Okay, just the same all over again the whole time. There's no changes, and it's at 130 beats per minute. Now, of course, this sounds nothing like the final product, right? Of course, we need to add in all these layers of texture that come later on. So let's immediately jump into level 2, and that's the delayed groove that we're going to add in. So to complement this basic pattern, what we're going to do is we're going to keep the basic pattern and add in sort of echoes, delays as called. And those delays, later on, we're going to distort them. Now we use a technique here called parallel processing, which means that if you consider that audio travels through pipes like water, let's say, and at one point the water splits into 2 separate pipes, and then later comes back together. That's parallel processing. And once the audio is split up into different branches, let's say, it can go through different types of effects. And then when they get added back together again, then that all creates one big whole. Let me show you how that would work. So here's the exact same drum rack, right? But this time we've added on the kick an effect rack called the delay groove, which is something that I just created myself. And what happens when the audio of this kick drum hits this effect rack? Well, it gets split up into 2 versions of itself. One goes through something called the dry chain, and the other one goes through something called the groove chain. The dry chain will sound exactly like we are already used to. But the groove chain, if we solo just the groove chain, it sounds like this. These are a bunch of echoes. These are a bunch of echoes of the original that when we mix them together, it sounds like this. Now you notice that we didn't put anything on the snare sound because we just want that to come through clean. And also a clean version of the kick sound is still reaching our ears. We're just adding in parallel this delay effect. If we look up closer what's actually inside this delay effect, we'll see a couple of things. First, there's Ableton's standard delay at 3/16, 100% wet because we don't want the dry signal to be coming through this. We put an amp simulator, then an equalizer just to tame some of the frequencies where it doesn't need to be, and a compressor, which is actually a sidechain compressor that's taking the signal from the start of the signal chain. It's taking the signal pre-effects on the kick drum. That means that the compressor will listen to the original sound of the kick drum before it hits any of the effects. And that way, every time that the dry kick comes through, this delay group goes down a little bit. So we get this kind of like swirling mass of echoes, but that complements the original beat and doesn't compete with it. Now you'll notice that this swirling delay group, two things about it. The first is it's still quite dark and not quite as rich as the Paula Temple track. The second thing is that the delays actually take a few seconds to reach their full intensity. So when we hit play, it actually starts with a more boring beat and then becomes more groovy and interesting later. We'll deal with both of those issues now. So when a sound is not bright enough, there are basically two strategies that you can do. One is use equalization, somehow boosting the upper frequencies in terms of volume. But here, the real strategy will be to use distortion. So all these sort of dark echoes of the kick, we're going to distort them so that they start crackling up in the high frequencies quite a bit. And that's going to make this sound feel massive. Basically, any sound, if you want it to feel large, you want it to fill the frequency spectrum from bottom to top, also from left to right, and also from near to far. You want it to sort of feel up close, but also far away. And we're doing that by letting the dry signal through. So a dry kick is up close, but then all these delays are further away. So we're really filling the entire box, let's say, with different sounds, all originating from this one sound. And this thanks to the magic of parallel processing. So again, I've copied this track over. And as you can see, this is again just the same drum rack. However, there's this delay groove, but now there's a new effect track called Distortion. So you see how far we're coming. So we were already here. Then this is the second level. And that's due to just a couple of layers of distortion, also using parallel processing. So again, you can see that there is one of the chains called clean, then another chain called distortion, and then I've also created another chain called rolling mids, which amplifies really the mid-range. Let me show you each chain individually for those of you who just want to take a closer look. So the clean chain is empty. That just means that the audio passes through unaffected. The distortion layer, first it hits an amp simulator. That kind of beefs up the sound. So here we're using a 3-band split. That's basically just an effect rack, the same as before, with 3 different chains. So the audio gets split into 3 identical copies of itself. And the idea is that each chain will focus on a different part of this frequency spectrum. So the low end, we'll leave it mostly the way it is. We want that thick, heavy low end to sort of stay where it is. However, the mid and the high frequencies, we're both going to run those through some amp simulators and then use only the mid and high frequencies of those distorted versions. Now let's just solo each band individually so you can listen to what the different types of crunch sound like. So the low end, pretty undistorted. The mids kind of sound like an old telephone with just the high and the low end frequencies removed, and it's going through a delay. It's going through an amp. We are then soloing only the middle frequencies, and then we're putting it through a Haas effect widener. The Haas effect widener just takes 2 identical copies of a mono sound and puts a delay on one of them slightly, just for a few milliseconds, which tells your ears that it's coming from the sides. This is a great way of widening a sound to place it very much on the sides of the stereo spectrum. And the high end, so that crunchy, bitey top end. This is something that you'll encounter a lot in trying to produce techno, is that you might be attracted to making darker sounds because they sound big, and when you put them up loud, they're very impressive. And yet at the same time, a well-designed techno track also has quite a crisp top end because your ears, they identify that as a kind of a freshness, and it also makes your tracks translate quite well on smaller speakers. So something to be aware of. Darker sounds does not always mean only using low frequencies. Darker sounds also have high frequencies like this. So together they sound like this. And unsoloed. Now there's another layer here called rolling mids. Let's have a look what's in there. This is another layer of mids because clearly the other distortion layer, I had pushed those mids very much to the side, and so there's kind of a hole in the mid-range that needs to be filled. So this separate layer kind of does that and make sure that there's a really tough, punchy mid-range to the sound. The actual effects on here are a delay, an amplifier, an equalizer, which makes sure that we've only got the mid-range, and then a saturator that saturates a little bit just those frequencies. This helps sort of ground the loop in the mid frequencies. Let me show you it without and let me show it with. So let me turn it off first. And now with. Much more robust in the mids. Now we've come quite far, but let's compare with Paula Temple's track again. Let me go from one to the other. There's still a few things missing, and Paula's track is even wider, so we have to figure out how to add even a little bit more width to this track. And what I decided to do was make another copy, and on the distortion rack create something called the side groove. Let me show you what that sounds like. Even more sides there. So as you can see, we're getting pretty wild here with how much processing we're just putting on one simple pattern. Because remember, we came from this, right? So you can be forgiven for getting a little bit lost in how all this signal flow is going. But just remember, there's the dry sound, then there's a delay that gives like the groove, and then there's a bunch of distortion on that delay. And those are the three steps, really. Then at the end, we're putting a little bit more processing, like some saturation and stuff, just to glue the whole thing together. But conceptually, it's only really those three steps. Let's have a look at some of the end processing here as well. We've got ourselves a drum bus, and then I got myself two EQs. There's no particular reason you do two EQs. This is just how I sort of did iteratively a few different versions as I was sound designing it, because you don't sound design something like this from scratch. You kind of go forwards and backwards and you squint. It's kind of like an audio sculpture in a way. You know, you make some changes, then you back away, and then you come and make some more changes and you back away and try to zoom out, try to zoom in, listen to some reference tracks, try to get it to where it needs to be. And so if I've done some equalizing at one moment of the sound design process, sometimes it's easier to just add some more equalization afterwards. There's some people who might argue against that, but I honestly think it's fine as long as it doesn't become like 3 or 4 or 5 different EQs, because then maybe you're not really considering all the different changes that you're making. But anyway, I would say that one of the main secrets here at the end is this drum bus for making everything sound as one coherent whole. What's happening in the drum bus? Well, there's some distortion here, the medium drive, and then there's this crunch, which has really cranked up to 60%. That, like if I play it to you without the drum bus, let me show you. It sounds quite friendly. It sounds quite friendly and not at all the character that we're looking for. So if I turn on this drum bus, this crunch, it's really filling everything out and making everything sound very crunchy. It's exactly what it says. So let's say we're pretty close to where we want to be. Now, there is a problem that whenever this beat starts, the delays don't start immediately as well. So to solve that, what I would do at this point is commit to audio on this. And I would say, let me freeze it to audio. So I've got an exact copy of it here, and I'm just going to hit right click, freeze track, and then flatten. And once it's flattened, you can see here, you can see that there's this dry kick, but then later on, it starts to get more chaotic as the groove starts to multiply. So what we'll do is we'll take the second half of this and just copy it over, boom, so that from the very beginning we immediately start with the full groove. And now there's a limit to how powerful this can sound in itself without a few other factors around it. So what I like to do is I like to create something called air, which is just any kind of room tone, static noise, anything that's kind of consistent and not changing, but that just gives a kind of an ambiance. Let me show you. This is something called a room tone from a Gold Baby sound pack. And what it's got on it is a sidechain compressor, sidechain to the kick, another drum bus just to abuse that crunch function, and then an EQA to make sure that it's only adding frequencies above 1K. And the way this pulsates along with the groove, it kind of fills up the frequency spectrum. Let's show you. And one powerful thing that Paula Temple does here in her track is at the very end, she cuts for a few moments. She cuts the beat for a few moments. Now, if we were working with this massive parallel processing situation, it's really hard to make these kind of automations because there's so many factors that the workflow is just not very smooth. It's way easier now that we've bounced it to audio because we can literally just drag this back, figure out where we want it to end. And then if we wanted to have this kind of like delay tail, like she has here, we can just add that in like as a layer that we've resampled by resampling some claps or some snares. So there we go, we're almost there now. So we've got our frozen audio, we've got our air, and then we would just add ourselves some sound designed elements which create the actual world of the track. I mean, once you've created this beat, you've only created one voice of the actual song that you're going to create. It's this beat plus a number of other elements. And of course, that's up to you as an artist to figure out how you're going to do it. What I've done to just be able to look at this sound in perspective with another musical element is I've gone into Silent, which is like a VST synthesizer, and it has an internal arpeggiator, which when I just go through some presets, there's some of them who create like a whole song when you just hold down one key. And after browsing a few, I just found these little bells. It reminds me of a kind of like a 90s horror techno kind of track. And then I did a little silly thing with recording my voice and pitching it down, kind of like in Deathfox, just because I wanted to see how that would go. So that sounds a little bit like this. And so let's just layer those in with the beats and see where we get. There you go. I don't pretend that this is in any way like a finished song or anything, but it's just to show the beat in context against some other elements. If you want to learn how to do more things like this, do consider signing up for one of our bootcamps or one of our deep dive programs on www.underdog.brussels. We are actually an online school where we run small classrooms helping people to break down their favorite tracks and recreate something in that style. I hope you learned something from what we did here today. Do check out some of the other videos that you'll find on this channel and leave a comment below letting me know if you want me to do any other track breakdowns from other artists. My name was Oscar. This was Underdog Electronic Music School. Stay producing. Be nice to each other and take care. Bye-bye.